A State Department official, Josh Paul, has resigned from the agency over the Biden administration's handling of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. In a statement, the 11-year official said of the response that it, quote, is an impulsive reaction built on confirmation bias, political convenience, intellectual bankruptcy, and bureaucratic inertia. Meanwhile, State Department officials are reportedly preparing a dissent cable, a document criticizing American policy that goes to agency leaders through a protected internal channel, over President Joe Biden's policy on Israel and Palestine. Biden's approach to the violence in the Middle East is fueling tensions in the United States government, according to the Huffington Post. One State Department official said, quote, there's basically a mutiny brewing within state at all levels.
Officials reportedly told the Huffington Post that the Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his senior advisors are seeing widespread internal frustration, and that some department staff feel as if Blinken and his team are uninterested in their own advice as they focus on expanding Israel's operation in Gaza. According to Huffington Post reporter Akbar Shahid Ahmed, staff at the State Department are describing anger, depression, and tears in meetings. And rumors that colleagues will be quitting are floating.
So joining us now to discuss is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Congressional candidate for Maryland, Joel Rubin. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Spencer.
So I guess my first question, you're somebody who's been inside the State Department. Obviously, no matter what policies are being pursued, there are going to be people ostensibly who aren't necessarily thrilled with it. Has this kind of thing happened before? Did you ever see this in response to policies that were being pursued in your time?
Well, it's great to be with you, and this is a very important moment in the State Department because any issue of war and peace requires engagement across the whole agency. Now, when I actually served as a career official in the Bush administration during the invasion of Iraq. And at that time, there was significant concern. I personally was deeply concerned about it and chose to go work in the Senate as a Senate aide and join the Democratic Party and fight the war in Iraq as a congressional staffer. That was my route. And then when I came back into the Obama administration, many of my colleagues from that time were still there. And we had a lot of these deep conversations. Now, Josh Paul is a wonderful person, and he's an excellent official, and he was always conscientious about his work. But I do think that there are ways to get the message across without necessarily blasting the policy from outside. This is going to be a long process. And the people on the inside right now, if they have the deep concerns, as they clearly do, they do need to put it in writing. They do need to send it up the chain. They do need to get an audience with the leadership to try to move the policy, because there is no magic bullet to fixing this issue. There's no one single simple solution, and it requires people of goodwill on the inside to continue to make the arguments and to fight for what's best, or to go on the outside potentially. But this is very early in this stage.
This is really interesting. I mean, I can look at this issue from the perspective of a civilian and look at the lives lost and think, what a horrible tragedy. No country should give aid to another country that's doing this. And then I can put my mind into the perspective of a State Department official. And perhaps they have to make the case that this is not good for United States long-term security if we're going to expand Israel's occupation in the region, if we're going to expand Israel's military operation in retaliation to what's going on, to continue to try and attack Hamas, and for the United States to give military aid for them to do so to the tune of $105 billion. It seems to me that that's not a hard case to make, that you're going to upset a lot of people in the region. Similar to former instances, the Iraq War being one, thinking of Mujahideen being funded by the United States, creating the Taliban. We create a lot of anti-U.S. sentiments with these kinds of actions. Why do you think that's not the perspective of State Department officials and they're taking the route of quitting? Do you think they've already tried that? Or do you think that they've just lost hope?
Well, the policy towards Israel didn't just come up overnight. The American policy towards Israel has been ongoing for multiple decades. In the case of the money, as an example, the United States has been providing $3+ billion of aid to Israel for decades now as a result of its peace agreement with Egypt. Capitol Hill supports that. The president got elected. He supports that. Ultimately, in the executive branch, it's the president that sets the policy. So when you're on the inside of the State Department, arguing about the different approaches and how do the tactical issues, counterterrorism, where Hamas committed a grave human rights violation by massacring well over 1,000 Israeli civilians in their sleep. So how do you respond to that? And then how do you also maintain the view of the big picture of getting to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? How does one cobble together humanitarian aid to the Palestinians? There are different bureaus that work on all of that. Now, the interesting thing with Josh Paul is he was actually working in the Military Affairs Bureau. Bureau for Political Military Affairs is the title. I've served in that bureau. That's a bureau that's been providing weapons and military equipment to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to all countries around the world. And I don't know why he didn't have reservations about those kinds of arms transfers to countries that were creating and have problematic dynamics in their internal human rights conditions, for example. But he chose this one. But, you know, at the end of the day, the president sets the policy, and it's the job of the career people to provide all the advice they can to say what that impact could be and push it up the chain and argue with the colleagues. But there is a decision maker, and that's the Secretary of State and then the president himself.
And I think, you know, as Americans have been watching, you know, obviously everything that's unfolded in the last 2 weeks there, most of them with really deep horror at what they've seen happen. And they want to know, you know, sort of why did this happen? And obviously for a lot of people, that's pointing to support from the Iranian regime. Yeah. Obviously they fund Hamas, they fund Hezbollah, they fund the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all these other groups in the Middle East. And then you see, you know, due to reporting and other things, there's sort of increasing danger around the world. And obviously for the State Department, they believe that diplomacy is the way to solve these things. And then just yesterday, we saw this alert from the State Department, this global warning, say that if you're a U.S. citizen anywhere in the world right now, you need to basically exercise even more caution than you normally would being abroad. What does that tell you about what's going on inside the State Department and what they might be hearing and how concerned they might be that this is not necessarily just an issue contained to the Gaza Strip and Israel?
This is a perfect question. Look, the State Department and the way it functions is to engage everywhere around the world. And what has happened over the last couple of days, the regional dynamics after the explosion at the hospital that killed hundreds of civilians, that unleashed an anger and a rage in the Arab world. And many instances, we saw in many instances that being taken out against the American embassy and a concern. That information comes straight back from our embassies directly to Washington, directly to the bureau that governs the region, in this case, the Bureau for Near Eastern Affairs that oversees our policy there. And they get those cables overnight, and they read from the ambassador what is happening in the situation on the ground. And that immediately gets funneled into the State Department's debate and discussion process. Do we order departures of our employees? Do we keep them in place? How do we work with the local governments who are ultimately responsible for security at our facility there? And this is part of it. And I understand from the administration that tomorrow there is a peace conference that Egypt is organizing in Cairo, and the United States will be participating in that with other Arab countries, because none of the countries in the region want this to metastasize and to grow into a regional war. And they want this situation to be local. And the Saudis, for example, even today said they want a two-state solution. They want an end state, like not just sticks, but also carrots. And I think that's where the president, he was speaking to that as well last night. So all of these are at play. But at the end of the day, the region cannot be set aflame if we're ever going to get peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
I think there's major tensions between, the bureaucracy, the career guys, and then elected officials in the United States. Yes. It used to be the case that Congress had to vote to authorize any kind of military intervention. We saw the rise of covert affairs and operations, and increasingly, a reliance on the United Nations to send troops, and all of these sort of workarounds, financial transfers instead of, direct military intervention that would require Congress to approve the United States being involved militarily anywhere. Do you see that changing, or do you see this conflict at all being a catalyst for that changing, so that there's a little bit more power in determining United States foreign policy, diplomacy, and military action by elected officials in Congress versus, career folks in the State Department?
Well, if we had a Congress that functioned, we might get some of that direction. We have no House, and so the appropriation request that was just put forward by the administration is asking for more money. Congress has a direct role over that spending. They can create the authorities that will go to Israel in this case and to Ukraine as well, but they're not there. They're not present. And so Congress, by functioning badly, by the Republicans preventing there from being an actual Speaker of the House, they are undercutting their own ability to influence the policy and harming America's image and national security abroad. So, yes, there needs to be a congressional role. Ultimately, these are funds provided by the American people. This represents the American people, and this is supposed to help the American people. And so Congress must be at the table. They must be having an engagement, and they must be helping to set the policy. Regrettably, the House, though, isn't doing that right now because of their own dysfunction at the Republican leadership level.
Well, Joel, thank you so much for being here, sharing your expertise. What's it like inside and outside the State Department? We will be right back with more Rising right after this.